Last year when I was here, I was a venture capitalist. This year I'm an entrepreneur. I'm the CEO of a new gaming startup that we're not really talking too much about. But I think what's interesting for me in relation to the other panelists here is that I'm now a customer, right? I'm now a customer and building my own virtual economy, and I'm really interested in figuring out what other people are doing well and what kinds of solutions they're using. Much like many of you in the audience, there's a classic build or buy versus question. There's the classic question of, hey, I'm a CEO. What kind of skill set should I be investing in internally? What kind of metrics should I be running my business by? And what I'd like to do is have the other panelists introduce themselves briefly for about a minute, talk about their business, what their focus is on. With us, we have one publisher and 3 service providers.
So I was just wondering how I ended up on a panel with 3 platform providers, essentially service providers. But let's see. I mean, we all know each other, and I'm a little jet lagged, so you'll all have to excuse me. My name's Susan Choe, and I'm the founder, CEO of an online game publisher called Outspark. And I see a lot of familiar faces out there as well, but in essence, what we do is what I call a virtual playground, where each of the games that we publish are sort of like rides in a theme park. And pretty soon we'll also be rolling out what I would call Main Street in a theme park, where you're allowing the gamers to be able to cross-pollinate. What do I mean by that? I don't mean literally cross-pollinate, but even though we do have wedding systems in the games, it's essentially chatting, meeting friends, gifting, even begging each other for stuff. So throughout this panel discussion, I'll try to shed some light around some of the key metrics that we look at. But how
many games do you have? How many users and how many transactions?
Okay. So right now we have about 5 games published, and one of which is a Flash items-based game, and we have about a little over 3 million registered users and about 2 million monthly uniques coming through our site, mostly North American. I was kind of jokingly saying that we could probably market our users to the international audience who's trying to meet US-based teenagers, because our profile of users are 16 to 25. So with that, I'll turn it over to my next colleague.
Okay. Hi, I'm Dan Kokowitz, and I'm CTO and VP of Operations at PlaySpan. Is not working well. And PlaySpan is a company that got started to basically build marketplaces with the cooperation and what we called sponsorship of publishers. And the idea was that, of course, there was this emerging, big business of third-party, non-sanctioned sites for virtual goods. And we identified lots of opportunity and correspondingly lots of problems that we addressed with a platform that basically would deliver effective and efficient marketplaces that would solve the problem of the introducing the hooks and technology that would allow these publisher communities to monetize their digital goods sort of internationally and across games. And that's more or less the business. And recently we bought a company called Pay by Cash, and I'm sure this is going to come up right away, which is that the issues of payment and payment security and reliable delivery of money to the participants is one of the major problems that actually comes up. So PlaySpan has sort of tried now to take a holistic approach, which says that we have to handle all the issues related to monetization of items and these digital economies with digital goods. And I'm sure everybody is going to talk about the same things that way.
Actually, so one quick question, Dan. Can you specify how your company PlaySpan charges for your services?
So, it's by negotiation with the publishers. The interesting thing is that.
Is it a revenue share? I guess what I'm.
So the answer is of course, and also other ways too. But one of the problems which everybody has to address at this particular point in time is that there is no such thing as the economy for virtual goods. What there are the games, and then there's people paying, and then there's ways that you basically try to standardize or normalize or manipulate, say, these environments to create sort of common economies and sort of, translatable structures that allow people to do things between games. So monetization is a big deal in terms of how you actually pay for things.
But I think from a a consumer point of view, actually, I mean, I would liken your service to sort of an eBay for items, right?
Yes.
So there's listing fees and there's
so from the
transaction
perspective,
fees.
right. So from the perspective of the consumer, right? I didn't know what your question was, but from the perspective of the user pays. In other words, the user pays for something, and where
then
the
there's
fees
rev
come.
share with publishers like us.
Yeah, I
so-
just think that's important so that, because I mean, most of our audience are people who are in the business of selling virtual goods, and so while they listen to you guys chat, it'll help them to have context about, how they might understand how to work with you guys.
Right. So, but the only thing I was saying was that, Susan's right. I mean, both Susans are right. So, that. To the consumer, there should be a standard view, which is that basically you want to buy something and you pay for it. It should look just like it looks in the real world. And unfortunately, it's difficult because of the issues of credit cards and whether credit card companies take payments for virtual items and PayPal and chargebacks and reversals. But from the perspective of the publisher wants to make a deal where they basically can make money off every single transaction. And that's, both sides
Okay,
of it
so
are
it's a
very
metered
important.
system for publishers. And Chris, you're with Live Gamer, and you have a very similar model in
Correct.
some ways.
Yeah, we Live Gamer provides marketplaces for people who want to either sell, and I want to set a couple of terms here so when we talk about it, we don't confuse people, because I sit in discussions internally with, we talk about things, and at the end of the conversation we go, so are you talking about the primary or the secondary market? And just for clarification, the primary market, from my perspective, is publisher or operator selling to the user, and the secondary market is player-to-player trading. So just so we set the groundwork, because maybe it's just me, but it gets confusing quickly.
It's B2C and C2C, right?
Right. So we provide marketplaces that can either do B2C or C2C, again, similar to PlaySpan, one of the things that is one of the bigger challenges is providing, a rich marketplace. And I think the other challenge that was talked about in a fair detail in the last session is having a solid itemization strategy and understanding, your marketplace and user, and building in scarcity and rarity and a lot of other things that aren't necessarily inherent when you set things up to begin with.
So Lee, what does Twofish do?
Sure, what does Twofish do? So I'm Lee Crawford, I'm the founder and CEO of Twofish. Twofish is enterprise resource planning, ERP if you will, for virtual worlds and online entertainment. We combine commerce, banking, and inventory management features into a single platform for publishers that enables advanced features like inventory management, economic management, and that sort of thing. It's really a horizontal white label platform atop which publishers build the types of experiences that we're talking about here today.
So I'd like to ask a question of the audience. So for the audience members who are in the business of selling virtual goods or are planning on selling virtual goods, what percentage of you anticipate that virtual goods are going to be more than 50% of your revenue streams? Okay. So one of the questions that I would have liked to have asked Lee Clancy and Sean Ryan from the last panel was that they made reference to a lot of different internal measures that they were using to gauge the success of their various virtual economic platforms, meaning, for example, measuring price elasticity and all those other things. And I wanted to ask them, are they building all of those tools in-house? How do they know if their tools are successful? And then at what point should you possibly look to an outsourced provider to provide you with some of those tools? Is it more cost, is it cost efficient to work with one of these service providers? And Susan, maybe you can walk us through the process that you went through to decide to go with external providers for some of these services.
So I would probably combine those set of questions with the references, or rather the focus made about the, having the right item strategy or plan in terms of what kind of items you release at what price point, supply management, and all of that actually goes hand in hand in deciding that buy, build, partner decision, right? At the end of the day, I think that the platforms and services are sort of the pipeline that you might run these services on, and so they are important in that how flexible they are to be able to implement business logic such as the dollar amount at which you might set security measures, right?
Can you be more specific? What does that mean?
So, for instance, in a C2C or even a B2C transaction platform or service environment ecosystem, you might have, and you often do have, sort of fraudulent buyers who are coming in at a velocity rate that you start to notice pretty readily. So, for instance, we have, fraudulent buyers coming in from Malaysia, and all of a sudden these guys are buying like $100, $800, $1,000 in one single transaction. Those things, pop up, and the first time you may let it go, but then when you start seeing chargeback related issue, you have to be able to quickly call up your partner and say, hey, I think we're starting to see these kinds of transaction issues, and can you put them into your business logic to filter out these kinds of transactions? We try to do that with PayPal. With all due respect to PayPal, I think it's a much more belabored process, which I know that Daniel James is sitting out there smiling, but he's, being one of the early brave souls who ventured out with PayPal and all the big portals, knows a lot about the pains of having to deal with these platform service providers. So,
how much volume were you doing before you thought that fraud became a legitimate issue for you to spend internal resources on?
So it's not really volume oriented. I think it's volume, or rather, it's not solely volume oriented. It's actually volume plus geos or geography from which you're taking your payments. We have, as I mentioned at the outset, about 75% of our users who are playing and paying are North American. So they tend to be less fraudulent. And, I think, again, with all due respects to the international traffic, whether it be Poland, Turkey, or Malaysia, they tend to have much higher, or China, much higher fraudulent, buyers, I guess. So, we have millions of dollars of transaction volume. It's not really just volume oriented, it's also the geo.
So what are you outsourcing these days? What have you recently decided to outsource? And I guess, what is your cost of goods sold allocation to your outsourcing process?
So on the B2C level, we have not outsourced anything because...
That's the primary market.
Right. And the reason for that is this. When we first started, there were very few people who had platform services as these. And also, I think the logic, the business logic that you had to implement was really new to a lot of players in the market, and this was just 2 years ago, right? I mean, I started this business 2 years ago from PowerPoint, but even before then, when I was at Yahoo Games and bringing NHN, which is a large game portal / Google-like portal from Asia, I mean, they have tons of experience in this virtual goods, digital economy, game space, and essentially what I noticed was whether it be Yahoo Games or where this kind of experience of product managing, if you will, digital items, which refers back to the whole item strategy and plan, didn't exist. And so you don't have the platform or the people who know how to market this stuff, probably other than maybe Blizzard and places like that. But even then, it's largely subscription-based. So people who know how to plan out your products online, just like you would a retailer, where all these hundreds of items online don't get priced or product managed out. So I think I've been going on forever here, but essentially the nuts and bolts of it is we decided not to outsource because there really wasn't anybody out there who understood the logic yet and hadn't built a platform. But in a nutshell, it's both a platform and probably the database and the algorithm that goes with for you to be able to actually outsource this stuff to somebody else. So.
Okay, so for the service providers up here, so you just heard Susan say that there are no vendors out there who can really help her with this merchandising and inventory management problem.
To date, to B2C, but I have signed with one of these guys, which I can't. Should I even talk about it? That would probably bias stuff, so I won't.
Well, you signed with them for your secondary marketplace.
Yes.
So yeah, why don't you talk to us? I'd be interested in hearing from each of these guys about What do you think you can really, why go with you versus building it in-house? What specifically are you doing that would either save me money or make me more efficient at converting users to paying users?
So, I mean, I'll start. I think we'll probably ultimately have pretty much the same story, but, you know, that there's this idea that the secondary market has to exist in order to sort of promote the primary market, where what you're trying to do is provide value to your users in the game by allowing them to monetize what they actually have. So there's to me.
So you're providing a liquidity function for users.
That's part of the value function. That's just separate. In other words, that's just saying that this has to be done outside the game in order to actually legitimize the economy. So what we think and what we're pretty sure of is that there's a fact that the providers of the secondary market function have to be outside the games. You can't do the secondary market yourself if you're really going to provide liquidity or value to the items in the primary market.
How big does my primary market have to be for me to care about using your services?
You know, PlaySpan's strategy is to make a very, very lightweight integration. So the issue is whether there's demand for anybody to actually buy it, right? So as a platform provider, there's no answer to that. It doesn't have to have any population whatsoever. It should just basically be usable to the community. But to be profitable for us, right, it just has to be that there's sort of velocity of transactions and there's value to the goods.
So frankly, I don't care if it's profitable to you. I care that it's profitable to me. So I guess the way I would measure this problem would be, you know, I guess what's the time to implementation? What's sort of the cost that would require me to set up a secondary marketplace? Yes, maybe initially there might not be any volume through it, but you know, there is some sort of outlay that I have to think about if I'm selling virtual goods to implement a secondary market at all.
Yeah, we found that most people only deal with us because they want to make money, actually. So that's not a surprising statement. You know,
there's a huge amount of hidden costs. There's regulatory issues. Every single state has different regulations around English-style auctions and eBay. And then when you go international, there's a huge another part of it that, you know, comes into play with billing, and this is the secondary market only. The primary market doesn't seem to be as much. The other challenge is trying not to be a money holder, because as soon as you become a money holder, then you're under the FDIC and a lot of other regulatory agencies you don't really want to have to deal with if you can avoid it.
So you're saying that you solve these problems for publishers because you can help me not become a money holder and become subject to these regulations that, you know, frankly, I wouldn't have known about because I'm not really in the business of understanding, you know, banking regulation.
Yeah, I mean, it's our core competency, whether it's Live Gamer or PlaySpan. It's what we do. We provide this service. We provide an end-to-end solution, and you know, the other part of it is that, you know, it's a challenge these days to build and ship and operate a game, providing services, and I think, you know, the marketplace is changing. People are a lot less against using middleware in many different forms and services, and I think that's, you know, as we grow and build our business and learn new things and fine-tune what we do, and you know, and I think you mentioned integration is a big part of it, is offering a lightweight and easy integration where there's no real pull on the publisher or the operator to get the marketplace up and running. Another perceptual point to think about is that if I buy a Toyota, I don't have to sell it back to Toyota. I can if I trade it in, but on a secondary marketplace, if the only place where you could sell your car was back to the initial publisher, there's a perception of, you know, controlling the market. Another thing the secondary marketplace does, by the way, we're talking about price pressures. You know, that's really where you can find out what prices are, because it becomes a meritocracy.
So I guess here's a question. So if I were looking to you for guidance about how to deploy my live economy intelligently, should I be thinking about building out the secondary marketplace immediately? I mean, at what, you know, Susan, maybe you have some thoughts about this.
Well, I guess, you know, all of these guys would be loath to answer what the limit of dollar volume or velocity would be for fear of turning away some potential customers. But I think, you know, you do need some depth of market. So, you know, we wouldn't have, and to my knowledge, a lot of the very successful 10-year-old, you know, game portals don't necessarily allow secondary trading market right away. You need probably a couple of $100,000 a month of primary market sales before you even start to get into that secondary trading market. And, you know, the other telltale sign is in your game or virtual world, you'll see people putting up stores, right? Whether it be they're shouting, whispering, putting up, virtual storefront, they'll do it. When there's money, they're motivated, right? So you look to the market. My whole mantra about, I think, online games or virtual worlds is that you look at what the gamers or the people are doing, and then you try to respond to it, right?
So that's a good point. So Lee, I want to ask you this question because I feel like we've sort of jumped forward in the conversation to a point where we're talking about things like fraud management and payment optimization, when really the problem I'm trying to solve today, or many of the users, or many of the audience members out here are trying to solve today, is just how do I sell more of these things? Like, how do I know if, the volume of, $1 items compared to $3 items is the right amount of, is the right ratio? How do I know, what are my strategies for converting users into becoming more frequent paying users?
Sure. That's a good good question. I think it also touches on the sort of buy versus build question that you asked before. If you're home growing a solution, you're really going to be focused on solving technical problems, which is just implementing the storage of assets, the items, the payments, integrating globally, et cetera. You're not going to get to the measurement, tracking, and analytics behind the core metrics that underlie your system. And so it's really all about flying by the instruments. It's about understanding what the key performance indicators are for your world.
So what are they? What do you provide?
It depends depending on the genre, depending on the demographic. Typically, first you have to optimize your user experience. So if you have an experience that's a freemium experience, free to play, typically you're letting people in the door for free. That stimulates the size of the audience, but you've got to keep them there long enough for them to become interested and committed to that experience. Otherwise, they churn away without ever paying. And so the first thing you have to understand is the interplay between the friction of the commerce experience and user satisfaction. What is it that makes people come back? What is it that makes people happy? What is the level of differentiation that's comfortable and not off-putting to your user base? What sort of items and capabilities and stats and entitlements cause session lengths to grow and visit frequencies to grow as opposed to increasing churn? Then you get to optimization of your catalog, which is understanding the elasticity curve, scarcity, pricing.
So not many people. So I'm lucky because I have a PhD statistician working with me on these problems, but not everyone can, has the ability to have those people.
Yeah.
So I'm collecting all this data. Now what do I do with it? What can you guys suggest, or what are you seeing in terms of best practices, or what's the easiest way for me to get from volume, all these logs and all this volume of data to something that's that I can make a business decision on?
Well, first you have to have the data. That's the most important thing, is that you have real-time access to the data. That's where commercial platform comes in. That's what we give to our partners. And then they've got to manage their supply chain. They've got to manage their experience on a real-time basis.
I think from our publishing point of view, we actually have a PhD who does nothing but what we call the BI dash. So from day one, we collected a lot of the data for our key metrics, right? But it actually starts for us at the marketing level. So we collect everything per marketing source and partner by keyword, creative, whatnot, from click-throughs to register to download to new user to when they buy, what they buy, how many friends they bring, how long do they stay, and overall, for the lifetime value, what are they worth? I think this is no new news for most of the game publishers, and it should be the sort of key set of metrics that you look at. That's sort of the basic.
Although the difference is that now, so many game publishers have very robust stat systems, right? Because their whole businesses are run by, how many days did it take for someone to level from 30 to 32, right? Or 30 to 30, there's
in-game stats, and then there's web service business stats, which are different.
So I think what I'm really curious about is that with a free-to-play model, there's now much more emphasis both on your organization and on your business to be a merchandising business. So what are the best practices with regards to, most of us in here are, technologists or web development people or product people. We're not merchandisers. What kinds of best practices would you recommend for us getting, for folks to get up to speed more quickly, or both from an organizational perspective for you, Susan, like culturally, what kinds of people do you need in-house? What kinds of stats are you measuring your employees' performance by? And then for people like the service providers, what kind of services do you provide people with better understanding how to merchandise?
I guess one question I also wanted to ask, maybe even the audience, what are you interested in? B2C transaction, primary market, or the secondary market, or whatever makes the most amount of money, I guess? B2C?
Yeah, are any of you guys, I guess raise your hands if you guys are interested in implementing a secondary market. So very few. I think people are mostly still focused on just how do I get my primary market up and running and optimizing that.
But as you guys are also in the business of facilitating primary transaction as well, then maybe we can just focus on B2C. So B2C wise, we definitely run what I would call a retailer business. That's essentially what it is, but also mixed with entertainment, because at the end of the day, the game play itself will keep some of the users, but not all of them. When you look at the gamers, and we do surveys and focus groups all the time, 2,000 people, 10,000 people, we send out surveys, and essentially, in a nutshell, half the gamers in our ecosystem come because of social interactions. The gameplay is good, but really the events and whatnot, that's really what drives them to come back. If you look at the top 3 or 4 types of activities, they're very social. It's not about monster killings only, right? So the types of people who I think it's hard. You have the gamers who are our product managers, and they're not usually used to using the stats. So oftentimes our product lead and myself literally have to get into the nitty-gritty of the number crunching. So there's not when you look at the data, it's pretty apparent if you set up the data correctly. So sales data, traffic data, the types of demo that come in and buy what, how, when, those are the things that move the needle. And then you have to, in our case, work with the game developers to try and present the right kind of merchandise at the right time, whether it be a holiday or specific milestone in the game itself of number of users or leveling or whatnot. Right?
So here's a question for Chris. You guys acquired the Sony Station Exchange earlier this year, and you mentioned to me this week that since acquiring the Sony Station Exchange, you guys have increased the average transaction volume per user by quite a bit. Can you talk about the actual numbers that you're seeing and how you've been able to do that?
Sure. One thing though, you mentioned we want to talk about B2C, and that's what most people are interested in. One thing to understand is that if you don't have a secondary market, someone else will build it for you. It's not a good argument with your mom, but they're doing it anyway, so you might as well control the situation and the experience and think about it. I think there's also a difference between shipping with a secondary market active in your system when you go out. It's a lot less contentious with your community if it goes out as a game feature.
But I would say initially, operationally, it'd be too confusing for our team and also for the users.
That's
good to have underneath.
That's why using a service provider solves that problem.
I was laying it up for you, Chris.
And Chris, do you believe that the secondary market exists to drive the vitality of the primary market and to keep the gray market from existing, or do you see it as a profit center for the publishers themselves?
I think both. It can be a profit center. I think it's, the problem is, and the reason that the secondary market's gotten a bad, I don't want to go too far from your question, Susan, but the problem that the secondary market's gotten a bad name is because it's been littered with connected to gold farming and fraud and poor user experience. When there's a black market and no legitimate market that exists, then that's going to proliferate. Putting a legitimate market in place that's publisher sanctioned inside the terms of service and inside the user guarantees, it guarantees that the people who do partake aren't going to get banned. They're going to have a better experience. And the other side of it is we're talking about inventory control. It gives the publisher, that's one of the tools we do, and I'm sure that PlaySpan has, is the ability for you to look into and manage everything that's going on in your economy, both on the primary and secondary market. It allows you to, if you don't want character sales, you can disallow it. If there's certain items that would unbalance gameplay, by being combined with another object or item that can be sold, you can do that. You know, and it gets incredibly complex. That's one of the things that I'm sure you're referring to, is trying to figure out how to have all this stuff synced so when you ship, everybody has a great experience.
Well, and also I think you get blamed as a publisher or the service operator, whether it be the B2C or C2C transaction, if the gamers or the buyers have a bad experience.
Yeah.
So they can't tell the difference whether if, you know, it's Outspark or PlaySpan or Live Gamer or Twofish behind it, right? All they know is that it's Fiesta. They just paid some Joe Schmo $100 for some asset and they didn't get it. So we get flame mailed, right? So I think we definitely want to engage in the secondary C2C market. One, because we want to move the gray market to a sanctioned market where there's better escrow management of the item and the dollars. And also there's actual proactive fraud management. And, you know, having launched online broking companies in 3 different countries, the banking license and the operational management of billing payments online is scary. So that's why we said we're going to outsource the C2C market, but not the B2C market, because that's something that requires a publisher to really inventory manage proactively.
So actually, I want to go back to Chris's question. Chris, you know, what was the average transaction size when you guys acquired Sony Station Exchange, and what is it today, and what have you done to increase that number?
So I can't release Sony's numbers, but what I can talk about is, since we've been running the Station Exchange or the Live Gamer Exchange, the average transaction price right now is between $50 and $60, and that's up significantly from when we took it over. We also have more frequency of transactions, and the marketplace, the participants have increased as well. That's on EverQuest 2 specifically.
And so what have you done? What have you guys done to increase those numbers?
I think nothing overtly, because we don't directly affect the game. The gameplay is managed by Sony and exists as it exists. But I think we've provided a better experience for the users in the marketplace, and I think we've proved to them that we have, you know, fraud is the primary concern and issue of people who partake in the marketplace, and we've reduced fraud numbers as well. Since we took it over.
But I would say it's akin to, you know, all of us probably buy more readily stuff online because we could also offload it easily on eBay, right? Mm-hmm. So that's where, you know, because you can sell it if you don't want it anymore somewhere in a very easy, secure place. That's why the primary transaction volume goes up.
Yeah, I think that might be true for some class of users, but I think that the people on this panel in this room are, you know, hyper-rational consumers, whereas, you know, probably your average gamer or your average consumer of entertainment products aren't really thinking about residual value. Maybe it's there subconsciously, but I don't know. I don't know if I buy that it's a primary driver.
So part of it is just that the movement of the model from essentially subscription to free to play is motivated by basically the perception, if it turns out to be true, that there's more profit for the publisher in terms of encouraging different kinds of purchases, different kinds of user activity, et cetera. So it's just a general commerce model in terms of encouraging people to buy things in context. And you're encouraging people as opposed to the characters. So that's one of the things that happens in terms of these service providers like us, which is what you have is you have a person who has an account who basically wants to have the same privileges across games and in the environment of the publisher or across publishers in order that they can actually do the transactions and buy things as they're actually presented to them. So one of the things that turns out to be fairly big, and we're finding out is important, it's just the context that you basically could identify for the user where you can make offers to them and they could make purchases that are actually likely to respond to. So it's just like what happens in the real economy.
So your partners are using your solution as a way to upsell users more frequently or have more meaningful transactions at a point of purchase?
Yeah, no question. And the idea is that, you know, it's not just opportunism. It's, they're responding to what people actually respond to themselves. I mean, people like to be in games and like to be able to buy things and to power up and basically play the games that way relative to what they've earned and relative to what their capabilities are. You know, all these things like being able to resell stuff or whatever, it's just aspects of user behavior. And I don't think they live in isolation. So this is the thing that we've learned at PlaySpan is that you know, this separation between primary market, secondary market, payment systems, microtransactions, or whatever is kind of artificial. That you really have to talk about basically being able to do commerce and being able to do commerce securely and take payment and just basically execute, you know, transactions as according to different models that are provided by the games. I mean, you know, a lot of these things that's really tough these days is you're living between legacy and new games. And new games are easy because new games you can build, and you know, that's what Lee's business is. Mm-hmm. You know, you can build in whatever you know, economic metrics and instrumentation you actually want, and likewise the payment system. But the old games are what are actually making most of the money at this particular point in time, and actually this third-party you know, gray market for virtual items is mostly on old games. And so the business that started in terms of us was basically to try to capture that. And
I
so
think I was told maybe I could triple my primary market with secondary trading by one of these companies. And I think, I don't know about triple, but definitely you do see a bump up.
Okay, so
but let's talk about what users are after. We focused a lot on what the publisher model for items in primary markets and secondary markets, since obviously monetization and profitability. What users are after is the ability to trade off the scarce resources of time and skill and money. And that's what items and secondary markets lets them do. I have a lot more money than I have time. If I want to play World of Warcraft, I need to buy my way up to meet the guild. If I'm in college and I'm in the dorm, I've got a lot less money, I've got a lot of time, I'm going to work my way up. And then the secondary markets let me trade those two scarce resources off. That's what consumers are trying to do, and that's why this is important.
So I have one more question before I open it up to the floor. My question is, I guess for all of you, I want to hear really briefly about what my operating margin should look like for my virtual goods revenue stream. And
I want to hear from the rest of the
what, your operating margin? I don't understand.
Yeah, well, taking into account, you know, whatever I might be spending on customer service, whatever I might be spending on fraud management, whatever I might be spending on billing.
So we charge 10% fee on a transaction for secondary market, and we split it with the publisher. So, you know, that's just for the secondary. For the primary, obviously it's whatever margin.
Right, but I guess that's gross margin. I'm really interested in operating margin, which is what is the cost of, you know, all the systems behind the scenes that I need to service my virtual goods revenue stream. What's a good rule of thumb? How much should I be budgeting for that?
I don't know if anybody has that answer, because it's probably unique for almost every single environment or operation. I mean, speaking strictly from
I disagree
the
with that, because
marketplace,
ultimately this becomes a high volume retail business, so there are some rules of thumb.
That's the, well, yeah, and you can probably apply standard retail practices and numbers to it, because fundamentally, you know, if your business, and one of the things that the earlier session talked about free to play and subscription, I think most systems now have kind of a hybrid model where there's the premium or VIP experience, and then the rest is, you know, you try and eke out some money from people as you can. Anyway, that being said, if you're talking about an entire operational component where it's your back end and your servers and your co-located equipment and all of that stuff, I honestly have no idea.
What is it at the Station Exchange? I mean, you have some numbers.
Well, we have. I mean, I can talk about numbers for the Live Gamer Exchange that runs for EverQuest 2. I mean, but it's the same. You know, I mean, it's what you said. We on the secondary market, we take 10% fee for the transaction and then do a revenue share with the publisher after cost of goods, which are any payment settlement transactions that happen.
Lee, do you have any?
I don't have any answers from, you know, I think it varies by vertical, it varies by volume, it varies by the level of depth of the experience. You know, I think that typically your payment and transaction fees are going to eat up 5%. You're going to have another 10% going to community management. If you're partnering with one of us, there's going to be another 10% there for whatever elements of the stack that you're using. Right. So I really think it is very much a sort of how long is a piece of string kind of question.
Right. Obviously, the costs decline over time. I'm just wondering, you know, as all of us think about how much we should be investing into building out a virtual goods platform, these kinds of an understanding of the return on investment is helpful.
Sure.
So, but just to make this clear, so say with PlaySpan, I can only speak for PlaySpan, but to enable the secondary market with PlaySpan, there's essentially no cost to the publisher because we're outsourcing. We're basically taking on the burden of fraud prevention, of being the merchant of record, of handling the payment system, et cetera. And there's no change to the game whatsoever. In other words, there is the integration cost, which is, as I said, is relatively light.
Right. You're saying that all of the revenue that we would get from partnering with PlaySpan is revenue lift. It's,
it's
in addition to whatever I might be
It's
generating.
incremental revenue over and above what it would normally cost. Yeah, there's no cost for our system.
For
I'm
secondary
not sure if
market.
yours is, but-
And there's no service cost because what we are is we're tying into essentially the user and item database, and we literally just look at what's owned by the users, and that's it. It's a very light web services call to basically get the information for the user and the items in terms of access control and ownership.
What's its
So
variable
I think-
cost?
Yeah,
right,
I think we
versus
should
fixed.
open up the floor to questions from the audience. There's a guy back, or is that a woman? I'm sorry, I can't. There's like
There's an arm.
There's a shadow.
There's some hair in the
I see
back.
It's a woman back there.
Hi, how do you figure out the pricing spread of your goods in a virtual world? How do you, when you have a marketplace
Who's the question for?
for the primary people?
Susan.
Okay. I think, the classic economics model is definitely at play in the virtual economy. You see, based on, you have to test price points, right? You see based on the data that you collect. When you tweak the price just a little bit, whether it be 5%, 10%, or sometimes even 20, 30%, you'll see movement or not in the number of items that are sold. But before then, you have to do some market research. Just like a retailer, you have to go into other games, take a look at what they're selling, at what price point, when and how, and that might be how you start. But then you have to take a look at what your users are doing and test.
I would also say that you have to have a really robust stats system. So for example, or a stats tracking system. So for example, the way that we're trying to solve that problem is, you run tests on random samples, you figure out what samples are meaningful, you figure out what number in your sample is meaningful, and then you make decisions based on that, by figuring out what your price elasticity curve looks like.
But it doesn't require a PhD in econ at the end of the day because it's really consumers. And when you look at, even if it's, in the classic sort of economics modeling of, I think it's socioeconomic stats, right? It sounds like really brainy stuff, but it's really not. All it says is even if it's the data sample is only 100 people, if the numbers, dictate a certain trend, that's usually right. And that's been pretty consistent for us as well. So you just look at, it's almost like
Actually, the testing platform is more important than the stats algorithm platform.
Yeah, I think having a PhD and using theory is probably the last way I would do it.
I would
Take a
agree,
guess,
yeah.
experiment,
Test,
vary,
test,
watch what
yeah.
your audience
There,
does.
there
That's
are,
the way
there
to
are
get it right.
operators and publishers who use the black and gray market to determine what price sensitivities are
Yeah,
as well.
at the end of the day, I think it's what the consumers are willing to pay
Yeah.
shows up in your BI dash. So bottom line, capture all the data that you can on a reliable basis. If it's not reliable, then it's worse than not having it, right?
But there must be standards these days in games because everybody's doing basically the same thing. You look at the games and they're sort of similar, and there's roughly expectations in terms of revenue per user and what they'll actually spend. So
It's true that the high volume publishers today are sort of setting a standard for consumer expectations and behaviors for all of the rest of us. That's true.
And I think also that's more from a publisher rather the consumer perspective pricing. If you do it also from an ROI perspective, you have to make some assumptions about number of players who would come in to play, and therefore based on that active users, and then the percentage of buying users at what ARPU, average revenue per user per month, right?
And
so
the cost of developing that content to service that user base,
yeah,
which
in
is
the
highly
developers.
variable.
Yeah, and so what's the ROI time, the return on investment, when you want to be in the black, and therefore how much marketing are you willing? It's the whole equation is not as simple as just one single item, right? I mean, that's where it might evolve to, but at the end of the day, you have to run each game as if it's a store, or each virtual world like a store. So this is where you have to think about key numbers for yourself, right? It's not the day of, I mean, I lived through the 2000.com days too, where everybody sort of sprayed and prayed. It does not work, okay? You can put $200,000-$300,000 of marketing out there and you wonder, why in the hell am I not getting the paying users? It's because you're not looking at the data and you're not optimizing how and who comes into your world, right?
So we have time for one more question from the audience. Ah, woman next to the camera. So the question is, you're seeding your economy to get it launched. To what extent do you use free credits? To whom do you give free credits to just sort of get volume going? Obviously, we've learned during the recent economic crisis that liquidity velocity is really important.
Yes, and we're still looking for that liquidity. When you get the users used to free stuff, I think the law in the whole internet business is that when they're used to free stuff, it's really hard to get them to pay. So you don't want to start off that way, because they will regard you. It's like branding, right? You're positioning yourself almost like Walmart, which still does great volume and velocity, but they had to get there.
I actually think of it as animal behavioral training, which is like, what are the behaviors that you're trying to get your pet dog to learn? And every time they do it, you give them a little bit of something. So, for example, you know, when I think about using free credits, you know, you don't just give out blanket free credits, but if they do something small, like, I don't know, putting in their real name or whatever it is, putting their real email address, you can give free credits for that. So there's some transactional element, so you get them trained to understand that there's a transaction involved that leads to a reward.
Yeah, we see a lot of folks do this not with the primary currency, the hard currency that's being converted from US dollars or euro, but with secondary currencies, loyalty or retention currencies. And so you'll reward engagement with these currencies, and it serves a couple of purposes. One is to train people sort of, time spent accrues value, so you feel good about the time you spend. If you have a very young demographic, kids who might not have the ability to spend money, it closes the gap between the haves and the have-nots. And then you can use that loyalty currency to list other items in the catalog that they can then buy and they can use to outfit their experience. And sometimes we also see folks who will dual list items in both currencies, and what happens is you tend to see cannibalization of the hard currency purchases by the loyalty currency purchases. But it does reward people for time spent, which in many cases might be all they have to spend on the experience.
But to seed the community, I think at the beginning, I would say don't give stuff away for free. At least the currency, right? I mean, people do often use like big screen TVs or graphic cards or stuff that really resonate with the early adopters, right? The early adopters have certain types of goods that they really, really want to get at. So those are some of the promotional stuff that you may want to use to seed, but not give away currency for free.
Sorry, go ahead.
I'll also say, and just this is maybe a small point, but it's that anything people can do to cheat, they'll cheat. And so you really have to pay at the beginning to basically say, weed out the real users and the good users and the paying users from the fraudulent users. So if you artificially put money in the economy, you're just asking for an instantaneous explosion of fraud. Well, so you have to basically just sort of dribble through in the sense of build up a model that's sustainable and reliable, so that you basically can say that users are paying users and they're rewarded for their behavior, but you just don't say any average user can basically just immediately buy in by getting something free.
I think Dan's point is very, very important, because you're setting a certain culture for your community, and once you set it, it's really, really hard to move away from, right? I've heard some investors talk about other communities where they use the word stuck in certain markets, and you literally get stuck. Right, so.
Yeah, actually, so I want to just point out that what Lee was saying about primary versus secondary currency is really important, and maybe Charles, for some future Virtual Good Summit, there can be a panel specifically on this topic, because I think it's really, really important. And I think we've run out of time, but what I want to say was just in reflecting about what all the panelists have talked about, I mean, the job in front of all of us in this audience is really challenging. Not only do we have to build compelling experiences, but we also have to figure out how to merchandise well to these users. And then also we have to figure out how to, manage the billing and fraud process so that we can maximize our profit margins. I commend all of you for sort of endeavoring along this really challenging path, and I'm really excited to see what everyone in this audience does. I mean, we're all pioneers in this space, and I think all of us are reachable via email. I'm Susan at ohai.com.
Susan at outspark.com.
Dan at PlaySpan.com.
Yeah, I'm C. Donahue at livegamer.com.
And Lee at twofish.com.
And if you email me mistakenly for Susan, I'll forward over as well.
Thanks a lot for your time, guys.
Thank you. Thanks, Susan.
I've got